Howdy! In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about child abuse and neglect. Abuse is improper or excessive action so as to injure or cause harm. That's kind of a fancy definition for a concept I think we all understand. This is maltreatment. This is treating kids especially, in a manner that leaves them injured or hurt. Neglect is kind of the opposite. This is not giving enough attention to somebody who has a claim to that attention. So, parents have a requirement that they should provide food, housing, clothing for their kids and should take care of them. So neglect is the absence to provide for the basic needs of that child. There are several different types. There's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's sexual abuse, and then again there's neglect. Child maltreatment does occur in all ethnic and socioeconomic groups. It knows no bounds. So you always have to be suspicious of it. It doesn't matter which part of town you're in or what type of house or anything like that. You have to be aware of the condition to be able to recognize the problem. And I think this is one of the biggest things that's really hard for us is just really being aware of how prevalent child maltreatment is. It's extremely common, more common than I think any of us care to believe. So signs and symptoms of abuse: if you have multiple bruises in various stages of healing, any injury that's inconsistent with the history. So there's, mom says, oh, she, rolled out of bed, but the kid has a broken leg. Kids don't really break legs rolling out of bed. Repeated calls to the same address, any fresh burns that are really kind of patterned, sometimes inconsistent with the story. The patterns seem inappropriately unconcerned about what's going on, or they may be very concerned about what's going on. They may just be responsible for it. There may be conflicting stories. And then the fear on the part of the child to discuss how the injury occurred. Or they kind of make up a story, or they don't really look you in the eyes, or they just seem really hesitant to tell you what happened. If the caregiver action seems inappropriate, and the child doesn't look to the parents for reassurance, those are all kind of cues that you may be dealing with abuse. Some of them, you may have some present, you may have more than some present, or you may have none of these present. Some signs and symptoms of neglect: a lack of adult supervision, a child that appears malnourished, any sort of unsafe living conditions, or any untreated chronic illness, i.e. an asthmatic with no meds, would be a sign or symptom of neglect. So here's some patterns, and I'm sorry, these pictures are kind of graphic and sad. So here's some patterns. You can see in the picture on the right over there the picture of the kiddo with the stocking or the glove type burns. Their whole hand is burned. And then you have kind of the one on the bottom. They call it the donut shaped burn, but really it's just the bottom's been immersed in a very hot liquid that has caused the child to be burned. Some other patterns, you can see there's some, bruises on the trunk in the picture on the left, like an electric cord mark, extreme malnutrition. There could be cigarette burns. The picture on the right, you can see the baby's bottom has been burned, and there's scratches or probably electrical cord type marks from like whipping or beating the child. There can be human bite marks. The patients generally have multiple fractures in various stages of healing. There can be facial bruising. And the facial bruising, if you think about kids, they, when they fall over, they tend to bruise foreheads. They may kind of catch their nose. They don't tend to necessarily hit the sides of their faces, especially both sides of their faces. So just think about like how kids fall, because kids are kids. They end up with bruises all over. It's when you have bruises that don't really make sense given kind of the natural tendencies of kids to fall over. Now, there are some signs that mimic abuse. There's a few on here. The one that's kind of in the middle pictures, these are called Mongolian spots. It's actually a pigmentation thing rather than a bruise. It's not a bruise. Even though it kind of looks blue, it's actually a particular type of pigment that's found in some individuals. Cupping. I can't for the life of me remember which culture this happens in or which tradition it is, but they actually take cups on the back and apply suction. It creates essentially a hickey on the back. The other thing over here you see on the right is it's called coin rubbing. They take a coin and they just rub it on the back repeatedly in these patterns like this. And it's believed that this will help heal, both the cupping and the coin rubbing will help heal whatever ailment is affecting the child, or adult for that matter. Risk factors: any younger children, less than 5 years of age, a family history of drug or alcohol use, a family history of domestic violence, and any family history of maltreatment or neglect. Management: so you communicate the need for transport to the caregiver or the parent. Make sure that you get this patient to the hospital and get them taken care of. Don't confront the caregivers. They tend to get upset. They may refuse care for their child if you tell them you're suspicious of abuse. And be non-judgmental and avoid accusations. You can consider law enforcement assistance if you need to get help for the patient, and then transport to ensure patient safety. So 4 key duties here: suspect or recognize any sort of suspicious circumstances, protect, provide appropriate medical care and transport, respect, be very respectful and communicate appropriately with the family, and collect. You're going to document your findings, factual findings. So this is, mother said this, injuries are this. Child said this, child, did not make eye contact with providers, child did not seek any help from the mother or, seek comfort from the parent, those sorts of things. Basically document your observations, and then you have to report it. Once you guys have a certification in the state of Texas, it is mandatory that you report any sort of abuse or neglect to, it's not Child Protective Services anymore. I'll have to look it up for you guys and let you know what it is. There's a particular name for the department in the state of Texas, and it covers abuse and neglect of all ages: children, adults, elderly patients, and they have it divided down in divisions. So you have to report it. Mandatory reporting. As I mentioned, you do have the requirement to report, and your documentation is very important in these cases. If it is found that the child has been abused, if the parents are going to be sort of prosecuted for criminal acts, your documentation may come into play. So you have to document your findings, and these have to be very factual findings. Document the bruise, document what the bruise looked like, document where it was, document that you have bruises in multiple stages of healing. Anything that you find on these patients, make sure you spend a good amount of time documenting. In summary, you have to be the advocate for the child. You're always an advocate for your patient. I think it's probably a lot easier to be an advocate for the child. And always consider the possibility of child maltreatment. It's unfortunate, but it happens very commonly. Document the findings in detail. Report suspicion of maltreatment to the emergency department staff. Ensure that law enforcement or Child Protective Services are notified. In Texas, you need to directly contact our Child Protective Services. So you can either do that via the online forum, you can place a phone call, or whichever your medical direction prefers, and they may have a preference for that. The other thing I wanted to sort of mention, I say that child abuse is very common. It's not as common that we pick up on it. When you look at, some of the hospital records and that sort of stuff, hospitals do pick up on it. They do x-rays, they see fractures, they have kind of a better paper trail on these patients. So they're more likely to see it and pick it up. And we don't. We don't see it as commonly and pick it up, which is why I think we need to be all the more vigilant about looking around for signs that this child could be experiencing some sort of abuse.